I retired, bought a cabin deep in the Wyoming woods, and finally felt what silence really meant, the kind that had no cars, no neighbors, no expectations, only wind brushing through pine branches, and wildlife wandering freely as if they owned the place, which they did long before I arrived. The keys felt heavier than metal when I picked them up from the real estate office, maybe because they carried the weight of 4 decades of work, of skipped vacations, of evenings spent repairing machines instead of resting, all to afford this tiny piece of solitude. Rebecca, the agent, smiled like she knew I wasn't just buying a building. I was buying freedom, the kind you can't rent or share. The drive there felt like slowly leaving civilization. Highway became street. Street became gravel. Gravel became winding earth. And soon even my phone's signal surrendered, which felt perfect. I stopped at an old general store on the side of the road, bought essentials, coffee, eggs, bread, butter, and a local newspaper that was already 3 days old. When the old cashier asked if I was visiting, I said, "No, I think I'm staying," and she nodded like I'd said something worth remembering. The cabin stood hidden among trees like it had no interest in being found. Its cedar logs weathered, chimney stone-stacked, moss on the north walls, porch creaking slightly in the wind. Exactly what I wanted, small, quiet, unremarkable, but real. For elk grazed about 50 yards away, living proof that I'd crossed into their world, not the other way around. I unlocked the door, stepped into air that smelled like pine, old firewood, and calm, and for the first time in years, my shoulders relaxed. I unpacked slowly, like I had all the time in the world, because I finally did. Tools went up on the pegboard by category: wrenches, hammer, small saw, measuring tape, each lined up with purpose. Books on history, engineering, and a few novels arranged neatly on a handmade shelf. Coffee maker placed exactly where morning sun would greet it, and a single rocking chair on the porch, meant for sunrise coffee and thoughts with no deadlines. As evening descended, golden and sharp, I sat with a cup of too strong coffee and watched the elk disappear in the trees while a hawk glided overhead, searching for something I couldn't see. I called my daughter Beulah, told her I made it, that I signed the papers, that I was exactly where I wanted to be. Her voice held pride and warmth and a kind of peace that I'd rarely heard. Everything felt right, but peace doesn't announce when it's about to leave. It just slips away. An hour after sunset, my phone rang. It was my son-in-law, Cornelius. He didn't say hello, didn't ask how I was, didn't even ask about the cabin. He said, flat and sharp, "My parents lost their house. They're moving into yours. They'll be there Friday. If you don't like it, you can come back to the city." Then he hung up, just like that. My fingers tightened around the phone, and I stared at the clearing where the elk had grazed earlier. They had already sensed something and left. Smart animals. I sat there in silence, not with nature this time, but with something colder, heavier, sharper. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was calculating. 40 years I had been reasonable, polite, accommodating. But solitude isn't something you ask permission for. It's something you claim, and sometimes something you defend. And that was the moment I realized something important, something that would change everything. Because if his parents were going to walk into my sanctuary, I would make sure they truly experienced the wilderness. You see, Cornelius thought I chose this cabin to escape people. He was wrong. I chose it because nature doesn't negotiate. But soon, he would learn that for himself. What happens when someone tries to invade a man's peace after he spent 40 years earning it? I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I dozed in short stretches at the kitchen table with a mug of cold coffee and a small engineer's notebook open in front of me, the same kind I'd carried on job sites for decades. I didn't rant. I didn't scribble angry words. I did what I'd always done when someone handed me a problem with impossible constraints. I broke it down line by line. What did I want? Solitude, peace, safety, boundaries. What were the variables? A remote cabin, wild land, predators, skittish in-laws who believed wilderness was a postcard, not a reality. What resources did I have? Time, experience, a lifetime of observing how people react when fear strips away their entitlement. By dawn, my notebook was full of small diagrams, arrows, bullet points, notes about scent, distance, timing, access. It looked less like a journal and more like a project plan. The keys sat on the table in front of me, the ones I'd been so proud of just hours earlier. I picked them up, felt their weight, then set them down gently. Cornelius thought he could force me back to the city by dumping his parents on me. He assumed I'd surrender rather than cause conflict. He'd miscalculated. I wasn't planning to hurt anyone. I was planning to educate them. There's a difference. Mid-morning, I drove into Cody, past the tourist shops and cafes, toward a building with Park Service insignia on the sign. Inside, mounted displays showed wolves, bears, elk, maps of territories and migration patterns. A ranger with a sun-browned face and tired eyes looked up from his desk. I told him I was new to the area, that I bought property off a county road, and wanted to be prepared. He launched into a thorough explanation of living in predator country, how bears and wolves followed scent for miles, how you had to manage garbage, food, and livestock. I asked careful questions, the kind a worried newcomer would ask, taking notes in my little notebook like a diligent student. When he mentioned that wolves could smell blood and meat from astonishing distances, I nodded thoughtfully. So, if someone left food out, they'd almost certainly get. Visitors, I asked. He chuckled, thinking I was nervous. Only a matter of time, he said. I thanked him again, made sure I looked appropriately anxious and grateful. After that, I stopped at an outdoor store and asked about trail cameras, said I wanted to see what kind of wildlife passed through my property at night. The clerk happily showed me models with motion sensors, night vision, cloud upload. I picked 2, paid cash, and drove back up the mountain. Back at the cabin, the air smelled like sap and cold dirt. I mounted one camera high in a pine watching the driveway, another angled at the clearing near the porch. I tested it with my phone until I could see myself in grainy grayscale walking back and forth. Then I sat on the porch with another coffee and waited until late afternoon before driving back down to town again. This time I went to a butcher, the kind that supplies ranchers and restaurants. You got scraps? I asked casually. Fat, organ bits, stuff for dogs? He wrapped 20 pounds of mixed trimmings in thick paper. When I opened the cooler of the cabin, the smell hit me like a wall, raw and coppery, the kind of scent that speaks a language animals understand much better than humans. I checked the wind the old-fashioned way, wetting a finger and holding it up. The breeze came from the west. I walked 30 yards upwind of the cabin, away from the structure, and laid the meat out in 3 separate spots, spreading it wide so the scent would carry and linger. I wasn't trying to lure anything to the doorstep. I was trying to remind anyone who stepped onto my land that we were in someone else's territory. Back inside, I locked the windows, lowered the heat to a safe minimum, shut off everything I didn't need. Then I loaded my truck and drove back to Denver, to the house I hadn't sold yet, the one still half full of furniture and stale air. There I set up my laptop on the coffee table, propped my phone nearby, and connected to the cabin cameras. The live feed showed an empty clearing, a dark porch, and the faint shimmer of wind in the pines. Then I waited. Wolves came that night, lean shapes slipping through the trees, eyes shining faintly in the infrared. They approached the meat piles cautiously, then with growing confidence, feeding, glancing up at every sound. I watched them with a strange mixture of awe and calculation. They weren't villains. They were just doing what nature made them do. 2 days later, Friday morning, a sedan rolled slowly into frame of my driveway camera. Leonard and Gray stepped out, city clothes, city shoes, city attitudes, pausing to wrinkle their noses at the smell of damp earth and resin. I turned up the volume. This is it. Grace said, "It smells like tree sap and dirt." "At least it's free," Leonard answered, already looking toward the door like he owned it. They started up the path. Grace stopped first. "Leonard," she whispered, her voice small and tight. "What is that?" 3 gray shapes glided out from the tree line, low and careful, noses lifted, following the fading trail of scent. They weren't charging. They weren't even focused on the humans. But to people who thought danger only existed on television, it was enough. Leonard went pale, grabbed Grace's arm. "Get in the car now," he barked, voice cracking. They stumbled back, half running, half sliding on the gravel. One wolf paused, head tilted, uninterested in the fleeing noise, turning toward the spot, where the last scraps of scent clung to the ground. Car door slammed. The engine roared. They backed too fast, nearly sliding into the ditch before jerking forward and racing out of frame, leaving a dust cloud and a clearing full of indifferent predators. I leaned back, exhaled slowly, and watched the wolves finish what was left before disappearing into pines, exactly like they'd come, silent and efficient. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. I didn't even need to check the caller ID. "What did you do?" Cornelius shouted, without preamble. "My parents almost got attacked by wolves at your cabin." His anger was loud enough to distort the audio. "I didn't do anything," I said calmly. "There are wolves in those mountains. Every ranger in the county will confirm that. That's why people shouldn't make housing decisions for other adults without asking them first." "You baited them. You set this up," he snapped. "You're sick, you know that? You're absolutely sick." "Cornelius," I said, my voice level, "you try to turn my cabin into your emergency shelter without my consent. The wilderness simply reminded your parents that this isn't a suburban guest room. That's all." He went quiet for a second, breathing hard into the phone. "This isn't over," he finally hissed. Then the line went dead, leaving only the faint hum of my empty Denver house and the quiet certainty that he was finally scared, not of the wolves, but of something he didn't yet understand. He thought this was about animals. It wasn't. It was about control, and he had just lost the first round without even knowing what game we were playing. I set the phone down gently as if it were fragile, though the only fragile thing in that moment was Cornelius's illusion of control. He thought he could intimidate me because that had always worked in the city, where people feared social fallout more than consequences. But here, consequences weren't social. They were territorial, legal, strategic. The cabin wasn't just property. It was boundary. It was proof that I had something I was willing to protect. And he had just learned that protecting something didn't always look like a confrontation. Sometimes it looked like patience. I closed a laptop, replayed the footage of his parents running from predators that never even looked at them. They weren't chased out by violence, but by reality. Nature doesn't negotiate. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I was just reminding them where they stood. The next 3 mornings were calm. Elk returned, a red-tailed hawk circled above, and I resumed the life I intended to live, chopping wood, logging wildlife sightings, sitting with coffee in a rocking chair, and for a short, while I believed maybe that spectacle had been enough, maybe Cornelius would accept defeat and leave me alone. That was naive. When people like him lose physical control, they reach for narrative control, and that's exactly what happened. It started with a call from my cousin Linda, someone I hadn't spoken to in 3 years. She used a voice that sounded sweet, but stretched thin, like it was covering something. "Ray," she said, "we're all just worried about you. Cornelius told us you've been acting strange alone in that cabin. He said you've been setting traps, hallucinating, baiting wildlife. Are you okay?" I let the silence hang just long enough for her to feel it, then thanked her for her concern and hung up. That evening, I received 2 more calls. One from a former co-worker, another from a distant nephew. Same words, same tone, same script. Cornelius wasn't trying to access my cabin anymore. He was trying to paint me as mentally unstable, unpredictable, dangerous. Because if he couldn't control my property, maybe he could control the perception of me. And if he controlled that, he could eventually make a case that I shouldn't be trusted to own property at all. I started writing again, not emotional rambling documentation. Time of call, date, who said what, names and phrases repeated. By the 7th call, I had proof this wasn't concern. It was strategy. When my own daughter called, I heard it. Not her words, not her tone. Those were hers. But the phrases, they were rehearsed. "Dad, Cornelius is just worried you're isolating too much. He said you were hoarding, setting lures for wild animals, refusing help. He thinks the cabin is affecting your judgment." I didn't defend. Defense is reactive. Strategy is proactive. "Beulah," I said gently, "have I ever told you something untrue? Even once?" "No," she whispered. "Have I ever manipulated you or made you choose sides?" Never. Then just remember that when people start trying to change how you see me. She didn't answer for a while. When she finally spoke, she simply said, I don't know who to believe anymore. I stared out the window for a long time after that call. The mountain looked exactly as it had the day I arrived, calm, unmoving, deeply patient. Nature doesn't rush. It doesn't argue. It doesn't prove. It reveals. The wind shifted suddenly, scattering pine needles across the porch. That was when I realized something. Cornelius thought this was a conflict of force. It wasn't. It was a conflict of documentation. So I started documenting everything. Call logs, messages, recordings, receipts, even the date and time I purchased trail cameras. But I needed more than proof. I needed protection. Not physical, legal. The next morning, I drove to Cody and walked into a law office. David Thornton, property and estate attorney, mid-50s, quiet, sharp eyes. I explained everything, without flair, without drama, just facts. And when I finished, he leaned back, thoughtful, and said, Mr. Nelson, your son-in-law isn't trying to move into your cabin. He's trying to build a case that you aren't fit to own it. He wants conservatorship. Conservatorship. Legal seizure of everything I'd worked for, disguised as concern. Thornton gave me 2 pieces of advice that changed everything. Document everything. And prove not just that you're sane, but that you're strategic. So I did. I scheduled a full medical competency exam, recorded it, requested written proof, passed every test. Psychological, neurological, financial comprehension, legal reasoning. I left with a letter certifying full mental fitness. The very thing they were trying to accuse me of lacking was now officially proven and signed. And that was just the beginning. Because I hadn't just protected myself. I had set a trap, not for wolves, not for wildlife, for lies. What happens when truth becomes the most dangerous weapon a man can use? I left the clinic with proof in hand. Not just that I was healthy, but that I was competent, clear-minded, rational, and capable of managing my own affairs. That paper wasn't just a letter. It was a shield, one I knew I'd soon need. Because Cornelius's plan wasn't to move his parents into my cabin anymore. That was just the first attempt, easy to spot. His real plan was quieter, more manipulative, reputation-based. Make me look unstable, dangerous, paranoid, then slowly push for legal control under the disguise of concern. But while he tried to control the story, I controlled the facts. Thornton, my attorney, helped me organize everything into folders. Phone call log, camera footage, wildlife records, trail cam purchases. But the most powerful folder was labeled simply APS PREMPDLN. Thornton explained it simply. If they try adult protective services, they'll accuse you of being incompetent, unsafe, or unable to live alone. So instead of waiting for them to do that, we beat them to it. And that's exactly what we did. We sent every document ahead of time, my medical exam, photos of my property, proof of financial management, even the detailed engineering style logs I'd been keeping since the day I arrived. Preparedness isn't paranoia. It's strategy. And strategy wins long before battle begins. For 9 days, nothing happened. The cabin was quiet. The air was cold in the mornings, scented with pine and wet soil. Wildlife crossed the property freely. Deer, elk, coyotes, even a bear one night. My cameras caught it all. Nature watched me, and I watched it back. Then on the 10th day, a silver sedan pulled into the driveway. I saw it first on the camera feed, then through the window. A woman stepped out, neat clothing, leather folder, tablet in hand. Adult Protective Services. Right on schedule. She greeted me politely. Mr. Nelson, I'm here for a wellness and safety evaluation. Just a routine check. I smiled calmly. Of course. Would you like coffee? She followed me inside, expecting clutter, confusion, instability. Instead, she found exactly the opposite. Everything was labeled, organized, stacked with military-grade precision. Bills sorted, house spotless, food fresh, firewood neatly split and stored. She walked slowly, taking notes. Any trouble preparing meals? I've cooked for myself for 40 years. My daughter used to joke that no restaurant could match my frying pan. Any difficulty managing finances? I showed her folders. Not chaotic stacks, color-coded sections. Bank statements, medical receipts, tax records, trust documents drafted by my attorney. She blinked. You set up a trust? With an independent attorney. I'm protecting my assets from potential coercion. She looked at me a bit differently now, not with suspicion, but with clarity. She realized I wasn't just sane. I was strategic. Then I showed her the medical competency letter, the psychological assessment, the stamped and authenticated cognitive report. She read it slowly, then looked up and said something I won't forget. Mr. Nelson, people who are incompetent don't gather this much evidence. She left with a folder thicker than the one she came with. 3 days later, the APS case was officially closed. Her written statement said, no signs of diminished capacity, no signs of neglect, confusion, financial mismanagement, or endangerment. Complaint appears motivated by property conflict, not genuine welfare concern. That sentence changed everything, because that meant in legal writing that someone had tried to weaponize concern to control me, and now there was documented proof. And I wasn't just compliant. I was prepared. I scanned it, saved it, duplicated it to cloud storage. I felt a peace that wasn't just solitude anymore. It was security. Thornton called me that same evening. Ray, he said, they're running out of options. When people like that run out of options, they get desperate. I finished. I heard rustling on the other end, as if he was nodding. Yes, and desperate people make mistakes. I walked out to the porch, the same place where I had watched elk on the first day. Only now I watched differently, calmly, patiently, knowing something had shifted. They thought I was running. They thought solitude made me weak. They were wrong. I wasn't hiding in the woods. I was watching and waiting, because nature doesn't rush justice. It lets things ripen before they fall. And Cornelius was very close to falling. What happens when the people who tried to expose you end up exposing themselves instead? The APS report didn't silence Cornelius. It cornered him, and cornered people either retreat or lash out, and he was never the retreating type. So what came next wasn't surprising. The method was just louder, messier, and far more damning than he imagined, because when people panic, they stop planning and start exposing themselves one mistake at a time. And his first mistake arrived in a thick white envelope from the county legal office. A formal accusation claiming I was mentally unfit to manage my property and should be placed under temporary conservatorship, signed by Cornelius and his father Leonard, accusing me of erratic behavior, dangerous use of firearms, hallucinatory ranting, and the intentional use of wild predators to harm guests. That last line made me laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was desperate, and desperation never hides itself well. I didn't argue. I didn't panic. I didn't write emotional letters. I simply sent the entire accusation to Thornton, who called 5 hours later sounding almost amused. Ray, this isn't a problem. This is evidence. People don't realize that when they lie on legal documents, they don't build cases, they build crimes. So, now it wasn't just a defense, it was a counterweight, because the very thing they intended to use to take my property was now the thing that would protect it permanently. Thornton immediately compiled 3 responses: the APS close report, the medical competency exam, and the signed wildlife documentation from the ranger station proving that wolves naturally inhabit my region and are attracted by scent, but that I had no involvement in any alleged attack. Then he said 4 words I hadn't expected to hear, but somehow knew were coming. It's time to escalate. The next morning I drove to Cody, not to the courthouse, but to a place most people never think to go, the local sheriff's office, where I asked to speak privately with an officer about harassment, false allegations, and property coercion. They took it seriously, not because I was emotional, but because I was prepared and documented and calm. You know what law enforcement respects more than authority, paperwork, and proof. One deputy named Keller said after looking through the documents, "This isn't family drama anymore. It's attempted legal manipulation and possible fraud." But Keller wasn't done. She leaned closer, told me something I didn't know. The Harrisons have been using your address for mail, government mail. They've been claiming Wyoming residency to apply for benefits, disability, low-income support. But your cameras show they never lived there. So now their attempt to discredit me was on record, and their attempt to claim residence at my cabin was now a federal violation, mail fraud, benefits fraud, possible identity theft. So I got in my truck, drove back to the cabin, and opened the mailbox for the first time in weeks, not expecting anything. But there was 3 envelopes addressed to Leonard and Grace Harrison, Wyoming Department of Family Services, First Mountain Credit Union, Social Security Administration. I took photos, sealed them in an evidence bag, drove back to Thornton. What happens when a fight stops being personal and becomes legal, irreversible, and very, very public? I didn't feel triumph when I learned federal investigators were now involved. I felt inevitability, like a storm I had seen forming for months finally breaking open, not because I chased it, but because I stopped running from it. Thornton's voice remained calm, controlled, not celebratory, just firm. Ray, I need you to understand something. From this point forward, you don't respond emotionally, you don't comment, you don't confront, you don't warn anyone. You just document, let their behavior. Speak for them, because people under pressure always tell on themselves. And that became my guiding rule. I stopped expecting decency, stopped anticipating logic, and simply watched everything unfold, like watching weather move across a mountain. I kept my routine, coffee in a rocking chair at sunrise, chop wood, walk trails, protect my peace, because now my peace wasn't just solitude. It was evidence, control behavior, measured response. That alone would protect me more than any argument ever could, while investigators quietly collected proof of benefit fraud, identity misuse, false residency claims, and signed applications. Something else happened that I didn't expect. Cornelia started come undone, not publicly at first, but through phone calls that stopped sounding confident and instead started sounding frantic, not strong, but cornered. He had run out of legal angles. So now he tried emotional ones, accusing, blaming, guilt-tripping, playing victim. Sometimes he tried to threaten me. Sometimes he tried to appeal to me. Sometimes he pretended to be worried about me, insisting that all I needed was family involvement and proper oversight. Translation, control. When he realized I wasn't engaging, his tone hardened. He tried to paint me as unstable to relatives, to neighbors, even to church acquaintances in Denver. He sent long messages about how the isolation was changing me, how the loneliness had made me irrational, how he was concerned about my safety and property management. But he didn't realize that every message he sent, every accusation, every implication was being captured, recorded, preserved, and time-stamped, not by me, but by the truth, and the truth always waits patiently. Meanwhile, I kept strengthening my barriers, building what Thornton called a fortress of factual integrity. I didn't lash out, didn't argue. I simply prepared, securing every asset in the trust, restructuring my accounts, adding security layers, and most importantly, protecting my daughter's future before she even knew what was coming, because she was still soft-hearted, still loyal to a man who used her trust instead of earning it, and that loyalty made her vulnerable. So I started quietly positioning protections around her too. Nothing dramatic, just foundation, legal guidance, quiet financial safeguards, and time. Time would be the most important thing she needed when her world shifted. And it was gonna... I knew it the day Thornton informed me of the next escalation. Ray, he said, their attorney is preparing to challenge your competence in court before the federal charges progress farther. They want to claim you are mentally unfit. They want to argue your trust isn't valid. They want to say someone manipulated you. I just stared out at the trees when I heard that, because I'd understood then that reason wasn't going to deter them. Consequences would, and consequences were coming. That's when Thornton leaned forward and said, calmly, logically, and without flourish, it's time for a formal evaluation, notarized, recorded, court-approved, the kind no one can twist. And so I went willingly, confidently, into a full neurocognitive examination with hours of memory testing, reasoning tests, spatial problem-solving, financial logic scenarios, psychological assessments. And truthfully, I performed better than most people my age because solitude hadn't made me weaker. It had finally given my mind room to function clearly. The report was flawless, thoroughly stamped, validated, and legally binding. And when the results came in, Thornton said words that would become the beginning of the end. Ray, he said slowly, they can't challenge you anymore. They can only expose themselves now. That night, I went back to cabin, made coffee, sat on the porch, and didn't check the cameras, didn't look at my phone, Didn't review documents, because I no longer needed to watch them. All I had to do now was wait. And waiting comes naturally when you understand something important. Truth doesn't rush. It arrives exactly when it's ready. And I knew it was almost ready, very, very ready. What happens when the truth finally stops knocking and breaks the door wide open? Federal investigators didn't move loudly. They didn't storm in with flashing lights or dramatic scenes. They moved like mountain fog. Quietly, gradually, relentlessly, until one day everything was covered and you realized it had been coming the whole time. Thornton called me early on a Wednesday morning. "Ray, it has begun. Warrants issued, documents seized, recorded statements taken. This is no longer a dispute. It is a criminal matter." And just like that, the line between family conflict and legal consequence finally split clean down the middle. Leonard and Grace were questioned first. They didn't know, or pretended not to know, that every envelope, every signature, every piece of mail connected directly back to my cabin, that trail cameras had recorded every minute they were ever on my property, which amounted to exactly 6 minutes and 33 seconds, and that their benefit filings declared they had lived in my home for over 60 days, when shown the timestamp footage of wolves appearing hours after they left. Grace reportedly whispered, "I thought he set that up," and that sentence alone, according to Thornton, was pure legal gold, because she had just admitted she knew they had no right to be there, and still tried to exploit it. Federal agents presented them with my footage, my documentation, my scanned records, even my APS clearance, and from that point on, there weren't arguments, just consequences, not swift but inevitable, as nature teaches. Consequences don't rush. They simply arrive. I didn't celebrate. I didn't watch the hearings. I didn't need to, because I wasn't defending myself anymore. I was simply witnessing truth run its course. And the truth has perfect stamina. Cornelius tried to hold out longer, but desperation doesn't hide itself. His voice messages change tone from aggression to argument to excuses to apologies to bargaining and finally silence. Then one evening around sunset, he drove up to my cabin unexpectedly. No yelling, no threats, just a tired man leaning against his car door. I stepped onto the porch. He didn't look at me at first, just at the tree line, where elk often passed. His voice was quiet, almost unfamiliar. "I lost everything," he said. "My parents, my house, my job, my wife. You didn't take any of it, but I blamed you for all of it." And for the first time since the moment he called say his parents were moving into my cabin, his voice didn't carry entitlement, just something surprisingly close to truth. "You know what the worst part is?" He said, "I didn't even want the property. I wanted control. I wanted to feel like I could fix everything. Like I wasn't drowning." I didn't answer, because sometimes silence is the most accurate reply. He looked at me then, not with hatred, not with anger, just a kind of exhausted understanding. "I never understood why you chose this place. I used to think you were escaping. Now I wonder if maybe you were arriving." He left without waiting for a response, and I watched his car glide down the dirt road until it disappeared. I didn't judge him. I didn't hate him. Nature doesn't hate, it reveals. The following weeks were quiet, genuinely quiet, not the kind of silence that follows conflict, but the kind that follows clarity. Beulah eventually divorced him, not out of anger, but out of truth, because truth doesn't destroy what's real, it just removes what isn't. She moved closer, not into my cabin, but near enough that Sunday dinners became ordinary, not a reunion, just life. One cool September evening, after she'd visited and driven home, I sat on the porch, coffee in hand, and noticed the cabin looked exactly as it had the day I moved in. Same porch, same rocking chair, same wind in the pines. But something was different. Something was lighter. The cabin wasn't just mine anymore. It was safe. Not because no one would take it, but because I no longer fear they might. That's when it finally hit me. Solitude isn't about being alone. It's about being free, and after a lifetime of working for it, I had finally protected it, not with fences, not with force, not with anger, but with preparation, patience, and truth. Truth doesn't panic. It doesn't argue. It doesn't chase. It just waits. And when necessary, it arrives. And when it arrives, it always wins. Want to know what happens when a peaceful man learns how to fight without ever raising his voice?